Hey everyone, and welcome back for another very exciting Blender tutorial. Now this is going to be part 3 in my absolute beginner tutorial series on how to use Blender 2.9. And if you haven't watched the previous 2 parts yet, I'm going to drop you the links to those down in the video description, so be sure to check them out first before you come back here. Now in the last part of the series, we created this cool looking piratey treasure chest. However, it's pretty dull and naked and just grey and boring. So in this tutorial, I want to show you how to create, modify and apply materials to all or parts of your models in Blender to just make them look a whole lot more interesting. In this video, we're going to cover how to create, assign and preview materials in Blender. Then we're going to go through all of the properties that you can modify to change the look and feel of these materials. And then we will talk about how you can assign different materials to different parts of the same model. Now this is going to be an absolute beginner level tutorial, but I will assume that you have watched the previous parts of the series or you're at least familiar with the absolute basics of Blender. Also, just a heads up that I did something pretty stupid and recorded the entire tutorial using Blender 2.8 instead of 2.9, in case you spot that version number in the bottom right hand side of the interface. However, for the purpose of this tutorial, everything should work exactly the same way if you're using Blender 2.9 instead of 2.8, so I didn't feel like re-recording the whole thing or faking that number in the interface, but just in case you're noticing it. Anyways, before I waffle on forever, let's finally jump into the tutorial. Welcome back to Blender, and let's just pretend this is 2.9. This is where we left off in the last part of this tutorial series. We modeled our base pirate treasure chest and then we added a lid on top. Now in this scene, I've just done a couple of cleanups. For one, I've created this references collection that now contains the image of the skull stencil that we used to create that skull logo on the front of the treasure chest. And I've added a scene collection that just contains a ground plane and a couple of lights. Now, obviously you can set this up yourself, but if you do want to start out exactly where I am, you will be able to download this file from my website. So simply go to surfacestudio.com/downloads and you will be able to grab this very file and follow along. Now, if you come up into the top right hand side of your 3D view and switch this over to rendered shading mode, you can see this is quite a nice little setup. However, our treasure chest is really just boring, dull, default gray, and that's because we haven't really added any materials to make this look any more interesting. So let's look at how you can work with materials in Blender and assign them to all or parts of your models. For that, make sure that the base of your treasure chest is selected, then come over to the right hand side to the properties panel and come to this little sphere icon down here, which is the material tab. Let me just make that a little bit bigger for you. And there's quite a lot of stuff in the material tab. Don't worry about it. We're going to go through quite a lot of this in this tutorial, but don't worry, you'll learn the rest as you go along. For now, let's come to the top of the material tab, either by using your mouse wheel or clicking and holding the middle mouse button. You can just drag around. And at the very top, you should be able to see that there is a material assigned to this box. The material is actually literally called material. In contrast, if we select the lid in our 3D scene, suddenly the material panel is all empty. That's because on the lid we don't have a material assigned yet. And the reason for that difference is that we crafted the base of our treasure chest out of the default cube that came in our default scene in Blender, and that had a default material called material already assigned to it. If you reselect the lid, there's nothing there because we don't have a material on it yet. But don't worry, we'll deal with that later. Let's reselect the base of our treasure chest. And there's this material assigned. It's gray. You can see a little preview here, a little gray circle icon. It is called material. And you can actually come into this name field right here. You can click on that and you can actually change the name of this material. Let's call this one default_matte. And you can see the name changed. So now the material that is assigned to this box is called default matte. On the left-hand side here, you have this pop-up, this little material browser in Blender, and this will show you all of the materials that you have in your scene and that you can select from. Right now, we only have our default matte in the scene, so let's click on that. Just going to reselect it and nothing will change. But let's actually make some changes to this material to alter the way it looks. So let's come down. And in here, you'll find tons of property for how this material looks and how it interacts with light. And there's a bunch of other stuff we can do in here. For now, let's simply change this base color here from white. Let's just click on this, brings up a color picker. Let's just change this to maybe a yellow or orange or green or whatever you like. And you can immediately see that being reflected in the 3D viewport on the left. So now the base of our chest is that particular color. It is yellow, which is what we've selected as the base color. Now, if you can't see this change in your 3D view where you're expecting it, make sure that your 3D view is set to rendered shading mode or potentially to material preview mode. Let's click on that. You can also see materials in here. Now, the lighting is all different because you're getting default scene lighting to make it easy to see materials. However, if you are in solid shading mode or in wireframe mode, you will not be able to even see that material. So if nothing changes, make sure you're in rendered shading mode for this tutorial, just so that you can see the change being reflected immediately there. Now, I don't like that my lid is still gray. So let's select the lid over in the Material tab on the right-hand side in the Properties browser. There's nothing here. Right now, we have no material assigned to it. And we can now either click the big New button to create a new material and assign it to the lid, or let's come to the left-hand side to the Material browser. Let's pop that open. And in here, we have our default matte. It indicates it's now a yellow material because we changed the color. Let's select that. And now we also have the default matte assigned to the lid of our box, and that's yellow as well. Now, it is important to know that if you now come down in here and change this base color from yellow to anything else, let's change it to maybe like a lightish green, that will change the color of the lid and the base. You're changing the material itself, and that material is assigned to both of these models in our scene. So changes you make to the material will be applied to all instances of that material within your 3D scene. Now, let's zoom in on our chest just a little bit more, and let's talk about some of these properties here that you can tweak to change the look and feel of your material. We talked about base color already, which really is just the primary color for your material. Now, underneath that, you will find subsurface, subsurface radius, and subsurface color. Let's just skip over them for just a few minutes. We'll come back to them in just a little bit. Let's just move on to the metallic property, and as the name suggests, this controls how metallic your material will look. Now, you can either just click into this field and type a value, or I actually prefer to simply left click and hold into it and then just drag towards the right to increase this value. And you can see on the left hand side how this changed the look and feel of your material. It now actually looks like a piece of metal. Now, it's a little bit hard to see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the lid, right click and select to shade smooth. And that's going to essentially render all of the corners round. And it doesn't look realistic right now, don't worry about it. I just want to be able to show you these highlights and how this material really responds to us changing these properties. So you can see this is now a metallic version of this material. If you click and decrease the metallic property again, it just looks more plastic. The next property underneath metallic is specular, which controls the amount of specular reflection in that material. And that's just the highlights. Right now you can see these white highlights here. If you increase the specularity, you'll see that those highlights get stronger. If you reduce that to 0, all of these little shiny highlights will vanish. Let's just jack that up to maybe 0.8 or so. So now we've got this really nice reflective highlights here. Obviously, you need some strong lights in your scene as well to see these highlights. Otherwise, there's no light to really reflect. Underneath specular, you have the specular tint. And this value controls right now, all of these reflections have the color of the light that they reflect. However, if you increase the specular tint, these highlights will change the color towards the base color that we have assigned to our material. So if I jack this specular tint all the way up to 1, you can see that now the color of all these highlights actually matches our base color and is not controlled by the lights that it reflects. Let's just bring the specular tint back down to 0. It's just a really nice way for you to control the color of your highlights. The next property is roughness, which, well, controls the roughness of your material. What happens if you lower the roughness? So have a look at all of these specular highlights here. If I lower the roughness down to 0, you can see how now the material looks like it's like squeaky clean, super flat. It's super smooth and reflective. It's almost like glass or like a mirror. As I bring up this roughness value, you can see that all of these highlights get more and more diffuse and softened out. And it now feels like a more rough material. There's less reflections in it. It's just a whole lot more diffuse. Let's just lower the roughness back down to maybe 0.3 or 0.4. Actually, maybe I'll lower it down just a little bit more to 0.2. I want strong highlights because next let's talk about anisotropy or anisotropic. I don't know how to say this properly. The anisotropic property controls how elongated your specular highlights in the material are. Right now, they're pretty round-ish, right? So let's bring the anisotropy up to 1 and nothing at all happens. And I think EEVEE doesn't properly support this. So let's lower that right back down to 0. Come into the render properties in our properties panel. And let's change the render engine from EEVEE over to cycles for just a little bit. I'm also going to change my device from CPU to GPU compute to make the most of my computer's hardware. Let's come back into the Material tab. And once again, let's increase this anisotropic property from 0 to maybe 0.4 or 5. And can you see how these specular highlights now get longer? Let's just check this up all the way to 1. You can see how you're now getting these really long streaks rather than round specular highlights. And that is what anisotropy controls. The anisotropic rotation then controls how much rotation is in this elongation. So let's jack this up to maybe 0.5 or 0.6. And you can see how they're now being twisted around. And you can play with this to get whatever look and feel you want. But let's bring the rotation back down to 0 and the anisotropic property down to 0 as well. Let's come back into the render properties and switch our engine back to EEVEE. Let's again return into the materials properties. And next, let's talk about sheen. And this property adds kind of like a soft velvety-like reflection, particularly to the edges of your 3D geometry. And it's really good for cloth, which has kind of like those really soft and velvety edges. So keep your eyes on these edges here along the trim of our treasure chest lid. Let's bring up the sheen. And that might be a little bit hard to see because our material is quite bright. So I'm going to come up into the base color, make sure this is a little bit darker, just for the purpose of showing this particular property. And again, just keep an eye on the edge right here as I bring up the sheen. And can you see how that just adds a little bit of highlight to these edges here? And this is much better for cloth. It doesn't really make sense in this particular scenario, but it just adds that sheen and velvety reflections to the edges of your model. Again, mainly used for cloth. And underneath the sheen, you have a sheen tint, which, similar to the specular tint, just kind of tints those highlights in the base color of our material. So if you lower this should become a bit more white because it's reflecting mainly white light. But if you bring the sheen tint up all the way to 1, it turns green because that is the base color of our material. But for now, let's reduce the sheen back to 0 and the sheen tint back to 0 as well, because we won't really be needing it for this scenario. Might also come back into the base color and just bring up the brightness a little bit more. Again, just so, just looks a little bit more friendly, not so drab. Let's come down a little bit further, and underneath the sheen tint, you will find the clear coat property. And for that, again, have a look at these reflective areas here along the edge of the lid. Let's increase the clear coat property. And I'm not sure that you can see this. Let me just zoom in a little bit more. And can you see how there's now a small additional highlight on top of the base specular highlight? Clear coat essentially adds an additional specular layer on top of your material, and this is great for things such as car materials that have a layer of lacquer or wax on top that creates additional shininess and reflections. Clear coat roughness then controls the roughness of that additional shiny layer, so keep an eye on this small additional highlight here. The more you jack this value up, the more diffuse these additional specular highlights in your clear coat layer will become. Again, super useful for extremely shiny materials. But for now, let's bring the clear coat as well as the clear coat roughness properties back down to 0. IOR is index of refraction, and you only have to worry about that once you deal with translucent materials, which we won't be touching on in this tutorial. Transmission again, transmission roughness. Emission is glowing materials, and I'm going to make a separate tutorial for that. Alpha is transparency. Don't worry about the rest of that. Instead, let's come back up and let's talk about subsurface scattering, because that is super useful, which is probably also why it's been brought up to the top of the material properties. Now let's zoom out just a little bit more. Right now our treasure chest is pretty green, but in particular, the surface feels really hard and solid. It feels like a solid material. Subsurface scattering, as the name suggests, simulates the behavior of light to penetrate into objects with a soft surface like skin or marble, and then scatter within that object and create this soft kind of translucent effect like the material isn't fully solid. So with our green lid selected, and to make sure that it's kind of green like maybe the color of jade, let's come to the subsurface property and let's increase that just a little bit to maybe 0.2. And now this actually looks much more like jade because light now penetrates into the surface and you're getting scattering of light happening just underneath the top layer of that surface, and it's starting to look translucent. The more you jack up subsurface scattering, the more the light essentially penetrates into this object and scatters underneath its surface. The subsurface radius controls how far the red, green and blue components of that light scatter. So right now, my red channel, the red light, travels further, which is why the subsurface scattering kind of has a bit of a reddish tint. If I lower this red value here to maybe 0.2, 0.1, suddenly the color of that subsurface highlight has changed, because now, maybe I'll change them all to 0.1. Now it's gray because red, green, and blue travel the same distance. If I wanted that subsurface highlight to be a bit bluish, I could bring this last one, red, green, the blue one, up to maybe 0.5. And now I kind of got this bluish subsurface scattering highlight happening. You also have an additional property called subsurface color. If you change this to maybe like a pinkish or maybe a yellowish color, that's the general color that light will take on by penetrating through the surface of your object. So the stronger you make this, the more of that color will come through. And if you reduce the subsurface again, so you can still see a little bit of it. And again, it's just more visible along the edges. But that's what subsurface scattering does. And you can play with this. You can create some really cool and trippy effects, all sorts of semi-transparent and translucent marble, skin, flesh materials. It's pretty exciting. And I'm really happy that EEVEE does support that as well as cycles. But now I feel like I've talked forever about the properties of materials. Let's actually start assigning some materials to our treasure chest to make it look a little bit more realistic and just a little bit more interesting. So let's select the lid and the bottom of the box and press delete or full stop on your numpad key to frame the selected objects. We can just zoom out and rotate around them. If you don't have a numpad, don't press the wrong delete key. Simply come up to view, frame selected, does the exact same thing. It just focuses in on your selected objects. So let's come back out. And let's select the bottom of our treasure chest. Make sure you're in the material tab in the properties editor. Let's come to the very top and let's rename this material from default matte to metal matte. I'm just going to give my treasure chest a metallic base. So let's go through the process. Base color, I certainly do not want this to be green. In here, I'm actually going to lower this S, the saturation value, down to 0. So I'm back to gray. I'm just going to make this just a little bit darker, maybe somewhere there. I'm also going to bring the subsurface back down to 0 because I want this to be nice and solid. And that looks a whole lot better already. Next, let's jack up the metallic property to maybe 0.6 or 0.7. Specular around the 0.8. Specular tint, I'm actually going to leave on 0. I'm quite happy with the color of the light being reflected in the highlights on that material. Come down a little bit, make sure your roughness is quite low, maybe 0.2. I want that to be fairly shiny so you can kind of see the reflection of the lights in the edges of that material. Everything else is pretty much just down to 0, so that looks pretty good to me. And let's assign a wooden brown color to the lid. So let's select the lid. In the material tab, let's come to the very top. And I don't want to make any changes to this material because otherwise I will also make changes to how the base of my treasure chest looks. Instead, I want to assign a new material to the lid that I can make independent changes to. For that, in the material properties, on the right-hand side of the name, you'll find this little duplicate icon here, and that's actually new material. So if you click this icon, we're going to create a new material. You'll see the name has changed to metalmatte.001. Metalmatte.001 is now assigned to our lid. And if you pop open the material browser, you now have two materials, one called metalmatte, which is the one assigned to the base of our chest, and metalmatte.001 assigned to the lid. Now let's just rename this as well from metalmatte to wood_matte. So now if you pop this open, you've got wood matte and metal matte, and the one on the lid is wood matte. If you reselect the base, that's metal matte. So that's now, they both have separate materials assigned, which means we can make changes to wood matte and we won't affect the base. So let's simply come down here into the base color. Let's change that from gray over to like a fairly neutralish brown, kind of like a wooden kind of color. Color-wise, that's not too bad, but let's actually right-click the lid again, and let's select the shade flat again, just to get rid of that rounding. It just really didn't look great. I just needed it to show you all the properties of the materials, so that looks a little bit better. Now let's come down. It shouldn't really be metallic, so let's lower metallic to 0. It shouldn't really have much specularity either, so let's bring that down to maybe 0.2, just a little bit of a shine along the edges. But maybe even 0.1, just very little. I'm also going to jack up the roughness because I imagine wood being a little bit more rough in texture. So it's just a bit more of a matte, diffuse sort of material. And that actually looks pretty nice. However, right now the entire base of our chest is metallic and the entire lid is wooden. And it doesn't really look very realistic. So how do we now assign multiple materials to the same object, to the same mesh within our Blender scene? For that, we can use material slots. So let's reselect the base of our treasure chest. Again, make sure you're in the material tab. Let's come back to the very top. And at the very top here, you actually see material slots. And every mesh can have multiple material slots because a single mesh can have any number of materials assigned to it because different materials may be assigned to different parts of your model, which is what we're going to do. Right now, however, we only have a single material slot, and that's taken up by this metal mat. However, in order to now add some wood to the panels of this treasure chest, we need to add another slot. For that, in the top of the materials panel over on the right hand side, there's this little plus icon here to add a material slot. Let's press that. That now added a new empty slot. And into the slot, we can now either create a brand new material, or we can come to the material browser, pop this open, and select the wood material. Let's do that. That's now assigned the wood material into the second slot on our treasure chest base. However, it's not showing anywhere, and that's because we haven't assigned it to any part of this mesh just yet. In order to do that, we need to go back to edit mode. So with the base of the chest selected, press tab to go into edit mode. Make sure you're in face selection mode up here, or press 3 on your keyboard to enter face selection mode. Hold down shift and let's select the faces that we want to assign this wooden material to. With all of the faces selected in the material panel, select the wood material, and then at the bottom simply press assign to assign that material to the currently selected geometry. If you now tap out of edit mode, we now have a mesh that has multiple textures. Our base treasure chest now has both the metal material and the wooden material assigned to different parts. And that looks a whole lot nicer. Let's do the same with the lid. So let's select the treasure chest lid. Right now we only have a single material slot, which already contains the wood matte material. Let's add yet another slot into that. And in the material browser, let's select the metal material. Press tab to go into edit mode. And I want all of these frames here to be metallic and all of the inner panels to be wood. And to make that a little bit easier, I might actually press A to select everything. Select the metal material, hit assign to assign metal to everything. And then simply select the face loops here by holding down Alt and Shift and clicking on the edge of the face running along this loop. And let's do the same with this panel and that panel here. Come around the side. And let's hold down Shift, click and drag to marquee select around all of these faces on the side. That looks pretty good. And I still got the ring selected. Come to the other side, hold down Shift, click, and marquee select all of these faces. Set go. And that looks pretty good. And these ones are now want to be wooden. So let's select the wood material and hit assign. Let's tap out of edit mode. And that looks a whole lot better than what we started with. Finally, let's add some materials to the skull face as well, because it just doesn't stand out well enough. So let's reselect the base of the treasure chest. Let's add yet another material slot. So over on the right hand side here in the top of the material properties tab, let's hit plus to add another material slot. This time I don't want to use the metal or the wooden material, they're already on this mesh anyway. Instead, I'm just going to press new to create a brand new material. This is going to add a new material. Again, you can then see it in the material browser here as well. But let's rename this one to Skull Matte. Hit tab to go into edit mode. Let's select the inside faces of the skull. Select our skull material and press assign to assign that material to the inside of the skull. Press tab to exit edit mode. Doesn't look too exciting right now. So let's change this material just a little bit. Come down. Let's change the base color to maybe almost black. Let's also make it metallic, bring up the specular, and maybe tweak the roughness just a little bit. So if there's really dark black material on the inside there, that looks pretty good. Let's just add another one just for the eyes, just so they stand out in nice, bright, and angry red. So again, let's come to the top of the material properties, make sure the base of your chest is still selected. Let's add yet another material slot to this mesh. Again, let's create a new material. I'm going to call this red matte, very creative. And this time before I even assign it, I'm just going to change the base color over to red. Let's come back into edit mode and unselect everything by pressing A twice quickly in a row, AA, to unselect everything. And let's select the faces on the eyes and the nose of the skull. And I kind of want to select the edge around as well. And I could go through and kind of reselect them all, but you can also just expand the current selection by one more piece of geometry to kind of push them out to include the next level of connected faces. And to do that, you can simply hold down Control and press plus on the numpad to select more. You can also press minus by holding down Control to select less, so plus and more, really, really useful. By the way, if you don't have a numpad, again, just come to select more or less, and then more or less, or just assign them to different shortcut keys. So with that selected, let's select the red material and hit assign, tap out. And Pretty good. I think I'd like the edges to be black. So again, back into edit mode. Let's select the faces on the front. Control or Command and plus on the numpad to select more. Let's select the skull matte, hit assign to assign that. And now let's just select the faces on the front of the eyes and the nose again and assign the red material to just that. Hit tab. And yeah, that I think looks much, much nicer. Finally, let's just quickly select the ground plane. Again, doesn't actually have any material, so let's just assign a material to it. Let's rename this one to ground_matte. Let's change the base color to like a darkish gray, come down a little bit, bring up the specular and lower the roughness so it's nice and reflective. And that looks pretty good. If you want to make this look even more interesting, come into the render properties, and with the EEVEE render engine selected, you can enable something called screen space reflections, which is kind of faking reflections. It's not true reflections like what cycles would give you, but it looks really good. So here you've got some nice reflections now. With the ground still selected, you can bring the roughness down even further to increase the reflection, but I think that actually looks really nice. And I think this looks so much better than what we started out with already. And we've really just scratched the surface of all of the cool stuff that you can do with materials in Blender. We haven't yet talked about UV mapping and texture maps, the shader editor, translucent materials, emission, like glowing materials. There's so much cool stuff that you can do. But hopefully this tutorial gave you a good fundamental understanding of how to create, modify and assign materials in Blender to make your plane objects look a whole lot more interesting. And that is all there is to it. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and please don't forget to like and subscribe if you would like to see more. All and any useful links you will find in the video description, and please leave any comments, questions or suggestions down below. And with that, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, I will see you later.